A lot has happened since Spider-Man made its debut on PlayStation 5 last month, and it's time we check in. Firstly, Spider-Man Remastered has launched on the console, bringing new visual features and a fresh coat of paint to the table. This is the version we'll be focusing on primarily today. Beyond that, Miles Morales and Remastered have both received a new graphics mode, Performance RT, basically a mode which combines real-time ray-traced reflections with 60 frames per second gameplay. Thus, today, we'll take a look at the remastered version to see what's changed since the original on PS4, and discuss the sacrifices necessary to hit 60 frames per second with ray tracing in both Remastered and Miles Morales. So, with that in mind, let's get swinging. While Miles Morales was the focus of the PS5 launch, obviously, Spider-Man Remastered is a nice addition, especially if you missed the game the first time around. The idea is simple. Rather than simply upping the resolution and frame rate, Remastered offers a wide range of visual improvements. New assets galore, ray tracing, and tweaked lighting all work in tandem to create an even more impressive looking game. It's still clearly derived from PlayStation 4, of course, but everything just feels more refined. So what's going on? Well, as with Miles, there are 3 modes now: Quality, Performance, and Performance RT. The original PS4 Pro version targets 30 frames per second with dynamic res scaling, averaging around 1584p most of the time. Temporal injection is then used to deliver a clean image when played on a 4K display. On PS5, the Quality mode bumps this up to a full native 4K most of the time, but DRS is in effect and it can drop closer to the high end of the PS4 Pro version in the worst case. In Performance mode, the game targets a near 4K resolution with more aggressive DRS that results in drops to 1440p. The new ray-traced Performance mode though, this is where things get interesting. This one tops out at 1440p, but can drop as low as 1080p in the absolute worst situation. This applies to both Remastered and Miles Morales, by the way. Like the other modes though, the game generally maintains a resolution near the highest value as best as I can tell, which is useful here as it makes for a nice comparison against PlayStation 4 Pro. You see, for my comparison shots, I'm using the ray-traced Performance mode on PS5, and in most cases, image quality is nearly the same, but of course this is at double the frame rate with real-time ray tracing. So basically the default modes offer a much higher resolution than PS4 Pro does, while the ray-traced Performance mode is comparable, though it can drop even lower. So the resolution stuff is a little convoluted, I suppose, due to the extra modes, but the key is that it looks really nice in each of these modes, and highlights how impressive Insomniac's temporal injection is. This is especially important for the ray-traced Performance mode, which we'll discuss in more detail shortly. But first, let's look at some comparisons between PS4 Pro and PS5 using RT Performance mode, starting with the game's introduction. This real-time sequence is rather useful for highlighting the attention to detail in building this remaster. If we pause here, for instance, note the increase in texture detail and model complexity. The web shooter, for instance, now has more triangles in it, shadows are more refined, and the lighting is improved. Now, let's unpause and continue. Moving ahead slightly, note the increase in circuit board detail and the addition of half-finished noodles on the right. After this, check out these glass jars. On PS5, glass caustics have been added to the scene, creating a more realistic image of light filtering through the glass and creating this effect on the table. Of course, this is just an artistic trick though, as simulating caustics in this way is extremely expensive, but it does show the attention to detail. This is really consistent with the rest of the scene. But when we get to Peter, you'll notice the change in character model. Yes, this has been discussed a lot on leading up to release, but let's consider some of the technical improvements. The strand system, discussed in Miles Morales, is present here in Remastered as well. You'll see this throughout the game when engaging with others, and it simply allows for more realistic, complex hair rendering. Characters also have improved skin shading and teeth, and some of these enhancements are even applied during gameplay. Subsurface scattering, for instance, remains enabled during gameplay. Check out Pete's ear in this scene. Now if we jump back to the intro, check out the toaster in this sequence. The circuit board has received a significant overhaul, as has the toaster itself. The material also showcases ray-traced reflections, revealing off-screen detail that you couldn't see before. I think you kinda get the idea at this point though. All the game's major cutscenes received a fresh coat of paint, with the artists going in and touching up nearly everything that could have used a refresh, and it looks really nice. But once we enter the game world itself, you may notice another change: the lighting. Spider-Man does not feature a real-time time of day system. This is something that changes his set intervals according to the story. For each of these instances, however, adjustments have been made. This is evident right away from the very first scene, where the shadow position has been adjusted and the lighting takes on a warmer hue on PlayStation 5. This is purely an artistic change rather than a technical one, I'd imagine. But what other things have been changed? Well, at a glance, it does look remarkably similar between the two and really highlights how impressive this was for PS4 Pro. But there are some changes. Distant detail is extended in two ways. Firstly, additional meshes have been added to the scene at a distance. Look at the top of this building and you can see some extra detail here. But also, building normals are visible from across the world, so this gives you the perception of additional detail rather than just a flat textured cube. Traffic can also be drawn further into the distance, though it is kinda hard to spot, and overall density is relatively comparable to what we saw on PlayStation 4. One of the most obvious things, though, that has received a boost is texture detail. Nearly every surface has been touched up, from large areas such as this, where the entire surface just exhibits more fine-grained detail, while smaller details such as this rubbish along the ledge is also of higher quality. This is pretty consistent across the game, I've found, and really helps improve the perception of detail, especially when playing at the native 4K mode. There's plenty of other smaller details as well, from more detailed pedestrians and NPCs, to various other tweaks throughout the game. I will say though that flipping back to Miles Morales does demonstrate the evolution in terms of visual quality there. It's certainly the better looking game of the two, as you'd expect, but Remastered really brings the quality almost up to Miles' level. The point is, Insomniac did a great job here and clearly put a lot of time and effort into enhancing and redefining the original experience. So to quickly summarize what we've seen thus far, you have improved character rendering across the board both in cutscenes and during gameplay. You have an increase in distant detail, higher resolution assets throughout the game, and improved lighting. But that's certainly not everything. I still think the biggest feature here is, of course, real-time ray tracing, and this is where we can talk about the Performance RT mode. So what is this mode about and how does it look? Well, let's quickly reiterate what ray tracing adds to the game. As I discussed in the Miles Morales video, ray tracing adds a new depth to the world of Spider-Man. Essentially, this allows for real-time, physically accurate reflections on appropriate materials. Swinging through the city alongside so many glass buildings is greatly enhanced thanks to the additional parallax made possible via these real-time reflections. In this game, rays are traced out to the horizon, meaning that anything logically visible within a reflection surface will be rendered in said reflection. To pull this off, however, the game traces into a slightly lower detail version of the city, so not every object is perfectly represented within the BVH structure. But really, this is only noticeable when looking at the reflections from close proximity. The effect of using real-time reflections during normal gameplay really cannot be understated. It's a huge upgrade over the cube maps previously used on PlayStation 4 Pro and in the older performance mode. The thing is, if you wanted these reflections previously, you had to settle for 30 frames per second. And that's where RT Performance Mode comes in. After the latest update, both Spider-Man and Miles Morales have received this option, and it basically increases performance from 30 to 60 frames per second, while sacrificing resolution and some detail and offering real-time ray-traced reflections. With just 16.7 milliseconds to construct each frame though, the processing demands are increased dramatically and optimizations were no doubt necessary. It's not just about the GPU either. The BVH setup has its own significant cost that eats time on the CPU side, which to me suggests that Insomniac has made a lot of changes under the hood to better support this feature. So much so that the original two modes, performance and fidelity, actually benefit, with any moments of slowdown that I previously encountered no longer occurring. But obviously, some of the optimizations will be visible to the player. Firstly, there's the resolution. The resolution of ray trace reflections in this game scales according to the rendering resolution. Essentially, when the game is displayed at 4K in fidelity mode, reflections are quarter res, or 1080p. When the resolution is dropped to 1440p, however, reflections appear as just 720p instead. Which is why when looking closely at various reflective surfaces, you will notice a diminished level of detail. The thing is, while you're actually playing the game, it's a whole lot less noticeable, and the effect is still very convincing. But this isn't the only change. Another difference lies in shadow map quality. This was already a very cool feature of the original version in that all shadow maps were displayed within the RT reflection. This is really important for a large city such as Spider-Man, as without shadows, the city will appear overly bright. Thankfully, buildings and some object shadows still exist, but the resolution is greatly reduced. While I noticed that pedestrians and other more dynamic objects now seem to lack shadows entirely, or at least are too small to be resolved in the super low-res shadow map. It's a completely sensible change, and it makes a lot of sense in this case. It also seems like pedestrians are called from the BVH structure more aggressively, especially those at a distance, but in most cases, I didn't find this especially noticeable. Many animations are also updated at a lower rate, so they don't line up one-to-one with the actual 60 frames per second animations seen elsewhere. Even with these cutbacks, however, the reduction is still impressive, and with the way the roughness cutoff is set in this game, even rough materials still exhibit proper reflectivity. The point is, most of these changes only apply to the fidelity of the reflection itself and don't actually impact which surfaces the reflection can appear on. And while we're here, we should probably compare what the game looks like with RT reflections versus the game on PS4 Pro. Not only are many of the materials improved, but the reflectivity is also modified so that it can take full advantage of ray-traced reflections. The results are dramatic, especially in some of these indoor areas. But it's something you'll also notice as you just explore the world. It's extremely obvious. One of the more interesting locations I thought I might visit, though, is the construction site. Yes, this is the infamous location at which Puddlegate took place. I explained back in my original Spider-Man video why it differed from the E3 build, but thanks to ray trace reflections, we no longer need to rely on manually placed box-projected cube maps. You know, the cube maps that were removed from the E3 demo, replaced instead with a more dynamic, but less accurate solution. Thanks to ray tracing, all reflections now line up perfectly with the scene geometry, and it looks much better now. It's like the revenge of the puddles, if you will. While we're doing comparisons here with earlier media, how about this screenshot? It was released before the release of Spider-Man Remastered. I attempted to duplicate this somewhat in the game, though the time of day was different. It looks different as a result, but really, look closely at the trees here. They didn't reflect quite right, and this is something that Alex brought up in his original video on this subject. But in the current version of the game, trees are handled differently in the ray traced reflections and now appear more accurate and less distracting. It also seems as if the materials on the windows themselves have been changed. Some windows are still very glossy and mirror-like, but others have obvious dirt and grime across the surface, which is perhaps more realistic, I suppose. So when you consider the three modes available, I believe that the Performance RT mode is perhaps the best choice all around. The increase in frame rate is hugely welcome, and even with a reduction in quality, ray-traced reflections contribute greatly to the overall experience. More importantly, I feel this is a good sign of things to come for owners of next-generation consoles. That Insomniac was able to achieve such results in a launch title is really impressive and speaks volumes about their engineering team, but it also suggests that there is perhaps a little more headroom or ray tracing potential than perhaps we initially thought. Whether this level of performance can be achieved with a more complex game, though, kind of remains to be seen, but I'm at least optimistic. Of course, we haven't actually discussed the performance yet, have we? And this is also key. Based on my testing, the game predominantly reaches its 60 frames per second target, just as the prior performance mode did as well. The dips that occur are uncommon, and the game feels extremely fluid to play. To really put this to the test though, let's check out a couple different scenarios. Firstly, we'll start with Spider-Man Remastered, specifically the introduction mission. I noted three types of performance drops during this sequence: occasional duplicate frames in the world, actual drops mainly during cutscenes, and duplicate frames on camera cuts, specifically in cutscenes. The initial swing to the first battle is all very smooth. It runs at 60 frames per second and exhibits no issues. But once we arrive and the cutscene begins, you'll note the same issue I mentioned in the Miles Morales video, where duplicate frames appear between camera cuts due to how these scenes are set up, no doubt. The actual battle then that follows this cutscene is predominantly stable, with just a few missed frames here and there. This scene represents the average level of performance you might see during normal gameplay, I've found. Now, jumping ahead to Fisk Tower, the moment where you bust through the window via a cutscene is enough to trigger some actual minor drops in performance, which is the third type of slowdown I mentioned earlier. Once inside and in combat though, it's mostly smooth sailing once again, aside from those occasional duplicate frames during combat. Like I said, this is pretty much par for the course for this game, and seems to be the consistent level of performance you can expect in missions beyond this. That is, it's very stable for the most part, with just occasional duplicate frames, and any slowdown that I did notice typically occurred in cutscenes. But what about Miles Morales? Well, I loaded up a later mission in the game, specifically when Harlem is under attack. This is a great mission because there's a lot of particles around the scene, volumetric fog is everywhere, and all kinds of effects are just popping off all over the place, along with the ray trace reflections and multiple types of enemies. Now, the brief cutscene here exhibits those same duplicate frames between camera cuts. But once you actually get into the game, it's exactly like Spider-Man Remastered. That is, I noticed occasional 1 or 2 frame drops here and there, but by and large, the frame rate hits the target consistently, no matter what's happening. As this scene is relatively heavy in terms of effects, it feels like a pretty good indication of the general performance across the game. So that's the logic behind selecting these scenes for testing. Now, I haven't had a chance to play through the complete games with the Performance RT mode. It is possible that some other scene in the game may exhibit an issue or two, but by and large, I feel that it should be relatively stable. But of course, the other side of performance worth mentioning is loading. Now, this benefits in exactly the same way as Miles Morales did, in that it's instantaneous. Starting a game, fast traveling, loading a save, all of it is basically loading time free. Now that we're removed from launch though and have played more games on both PS5 and the Xbox consoles, it's kind of obvious to me that Insomniac is ahead of basically everyone else in terms of this sort of thing. The loading is ridiculously fast, and pretty much no other game released alongside these machines can touch it. So well done, engineering team. As an aside, I did test the save transfer feature. This one is interesting in that it works just fine, and even pops all of your trophies that were previously earned on PlayStation 4 the second you actually load it. But the actual process is a little convoluted. You see, Remastered is technically a new game, rather than a patched version of a prior release, which makes things a little tricky, I'd imagine, but basically you have to first download the PS4 version, then start the PS4 version, upload your save from the main menu to the cloud, and then start the game on PS5, where you can download the save to one of the save slots. It works fine, but it's not really elegant. I gather that this is more a limitation of the PS5's OS setup than anything else, and Insomniac just had to find another way to work around it. Still, overall, both Spider-Man Remastered and the RT Performance mode are excellent, and come highly recommended all around. I do wish Remastered were sold as a standalone disc-based game to add to my collection, of course, but either way, it's solid. So yeah, at this point it's safe to say that Insomniac is off to a great start for this generation, and I look forward to seeing what other games they deliver over the next few years. Obviously, Ratchet and Clank is next up on the list, and hopefully we'll see something like the RT Performance mode in that game as well. But seeing how much more demanding it looks on the surface at least, that may be a tall order. But we'll have to wait and see. For now though, that's going to do it for this video, so if you did enjoy it, be sure to let us know. Like, subscribe, ring the notification bell, find us on Twitter, all that good stuff. And until next time, this is John signing off.